The Pentagon Papers conspiracy. Did the US control the truth about Vietnam? The pages were never meant to be read. They were typed in secure rooms, circulated among defense officials, filed inside locked cabinets, stamped with classifications that implied urgency, danger, and permanence. Top secret, sensitive, eyes only. They did not contain battlefield strategy. They were not operational orders. They were something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. An internal history, a private accounting, a record of what leaders knew, what they feared, and what they chose to say instead. In 1971, when thousands of those pages reached the front page of a national newspaper, the shock was not about a single revelation. It was about a pattern. For decades, Americans had been told that the war in Vietnam was necessary, contained, winnable, that progress was steady, that escalation was reluctant but justified. But inside the government's own archives, a different tone had existed. Doubt, pessimism, strategic hesitation. The question that emerged was not simply whether officials had made mistakes. It was whether the public had been deliberately guided toward a version of reality that leaders privately did not believe. This documentary examines how one classified study, later known as the Pentagon Papers, exposed internal contradictions within US policy and altered public trust in government narratives. It explores the historical context, the institutions involved, and the debates that followed their publication. The interpretations discussed reflect documented records and public discourse surrounding them. Because before the leak, before the headlines, before the courtroom battle over press freedom, there was a war already unfolding. To understand why those documents mattered, we have to step back. In the years following the Second World War, global power realigned. The United States emerged economically dominant, militarily unmatched, and ideologically opposed to the expanding influence of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not declared in a single speech, but it settled into policy with unmistakable clarity. Containment became doctrine. Communism, American leaders argued, could not be allowed to spread unchecked. The domino theory entered public language. If one nation fell to communist control, neighboring states would follow, destabilizing entire regions. Southeast Asia became a focal point of that anxiety. Vietnam, at the time part of French Indochina, had been under colonial rule. When nationalist and communist forces, led by Ho Chi Minh, sought independence after World War II, conflict followed. France attempted to reassert control. By the early 1950s, the United States was financing much of the French military effort. When France withdrew after defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. National elections were scheduled, but never held. Instead, a separate government formed in South Vietnam, backed by American support. From that point forward, US involvement deepened gradually. Under President Harry Truman, assistance began largely as financial support. Under Dwight Eisenhower, military advisors were dispatched. Under John F. Kennedy, the number of advisors expanded significantly, though official combat troops were not yet deployed in large numbers. Each administration framed its decisions within the larger Cold War struggle. The language emphasized defense of freedom, resistance to aggression, and strategic stability. By the time Lyndon B. Johnson assumed office after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, the situation in Vietnam had grown increasingly unstable. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 became a turning point. Reports of attacks on US naval vessels led Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. American troop presence escalated dramatically in the years that followed. Bombing campaigns intensified, casualties rose, and yet official statements consistently projected confidence. Press briefings spoke of measurable progress. Body counts were cited as evidence of attrition success. Phrases such as light at the end of the tunnel entered the national vocabulary. Television brought the war into living rooms in a way no previous conflict had done. Images of jungle combat, burning villages and wounded soldiers aired alongside official reassurances. The contrast was subtle at first. Over time, it became harder to ignore. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, something else was underway. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a comprehensive internal study. Officially titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, it aimed to document U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 through 1967. The purpose was not public transparency. It was internal clarity. McNamara, who had overseen significant escalation of the war, was reportedly increasingly skeptical about its trajectory. The study gathered classified cables, internal memos, intelligence assessments, and policy analyses across 4 presidential administrations. Analysts compiled roughly 7,000 pages of documentation. It was, in effect, a secret history written by the government about itself. Few outside the highest levels of defense leadership knew it existed. Why was such secrecy possible? Part of the answer lies in the structure of the national security apparatus. Classification systems had expanded significantly after World War II. The executive branch controlled intelligence dissemination. Congressional oversight existed, but was limited in scope and often reliant on executive briefings. The public, meanwhile, depended on official statements, press conferences, and media reporting that often relied on government sources. Investigative journalism existed, but access to primary classified material was rare. Trust in federal institutions remained comparatively strong in the early 1960s. The United States had emerged victorious from global conflict. Economic growth was steady. Technological achievements, including the space race, reinforced confidence in leadership. Yet beneath that confidence, cultural tensions were building. The civil rights movement challenged systemic inequality. Student activism grew. The draft, which disproportionately affected certain socioeconomic groups, intensified generational divides. As troop deployments expanded, so did protests. The war increasingly became not just a foreign policy issue, but a domestic one. Inside government circles, assessments of the war's viability were not uniformly optimistic. Internal memoranda reflected uncertainty. Some intelligence analyses questioned the likelihood of achieving stated objectives. Others warned that escalation might not yield decisive results. Public messaging, however, often emphasized determination and progress. This gap between internal deliberation and external communication did not necessarily imply coordination across all agencies or unanimity among officials. Government institutions are rarely monolithic. Disagreement, debate, and strategic framing coexist within bureaucratic systems. But the existence of the Pentagon study suggested something specific: that leaders felt the need to privately reconstruct the full historical record of their involvement, separate from what had been publicly communicated. The study chronicled covert operations in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. It documented political calculations behind military decisions. It revealed that even early in the conflict, some officials doubted that South Vietnam could sustain itself independently without extensive U.S. intervention. At the same time, successive administrations continued to reassure the public that commitment was necessary and victory attainable. The tension between internal doubt and public certainty did not surface immediately. The study remained classified. Its pages were bound and stored. For several years, it sat unread outside restricted circles. But history rarely remains contained. By the late 1960s, public opinion was shifting sharply. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a coordinated series of attacks by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, contradicted prior claims that the enemy was weakening. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelled the offensive, its psychological impact was profound. Confidence eroded. President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon campaigned on promises of peace with honor. Troop withdrawals began gradually under a policy of Vietnamization, shifting combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. Even as policy adjusted, the classified study remained unknown to the public. It would take one individual and a decision that carried legal and personal consequences to change that. But before that moment arrives in this story, it is worth pausing on the broader climate in which these documents were created. The Cold War was not merely a geopolitical standoff. It was an organizing principle of American governance. Intelligence agencies expanded. Covert operations became instruments of foreign policy. Information was compartmentalized in the name of national security. Secrecy was not unusual. It was institutional. At the same time, the press operated under evolving norms. Investigative reporting was growing more assertive, but relationships between journalists and government officials were often built on negotiated access. The boundary between transparency and secrecy was constantly negotiated. Within that environment, the Pentagon Papers were not conceived as a public reckoning. They were an internal archive. Yet the existence of such an archive raised implicit questions. If leaders documented their private doubts, what responsibility did they have to share them? If policy continued despite internal pessimism, was that persistence strategic necessity, political calculation, or something else entirely? And when citizens consent to war, how informed must that consent be? These questions did not fully crystallize until 1971, when portions of the study began appearing in print. But even before the first headline, the groundwork had been laid. The war's origins, the ideology of containment, the institutional culture of secrecy, the widening gap between public assurance and televised reality. The Pentagon Papers did not create mistrust in government narratives. They exposed a fracture that had already formed. What followed would test the limits of press freedom, executive power, and the public's willingness to believe official accounts. The documents would force a confrontation between two competing principles: national security and public transparency. And in doing so, they would permanently alter the relationship between citizens and the information provided in their name. The pages were never meant to be read. But once they were, the question was no longer only about Vietnam. It was about truth, control, and who decides what the public is allowed to know. The official narrative. When the Pentagon Papers first appeared in print in June of 1971, the shock was immediate. But the government's response was not confusion. It was structured, deliberate, and rooted in a long-standing understanding of executive authority. Before the legal battle, before the public debates about deception and secrecy, there was the official position. And to understand the confrontation that followed, it is necessary to examine how the United States government framed both the war in Vietnam and the leak itself. Throughout the 1960s, successive administrations presented U.S. involvement in Vietnam as a strategic necessity shaped by global containment policy. The narrative was consistent across public addresses, congressional briefings, and press conferences. The United States, officials argued, had an obligation to defend South Vietnam against communist aggression. Failure to act would destabilize Southeast Asia, embolden adversaries, and undermine American credibility worldwide. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 was central to this framing. After reports that North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked U.S. naval vessels in international waters, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the nation, describing the incident as unprovoked aggression. Congress responded swiftly, passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The resolution authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel armed attacks and prevent further aggression. At the time, the resolution passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. From that point forward, troop deployments increased significantly. By 1968, more than 500,000 American service members were stationed in Vietnam. Public briefings emphasized measurable progress. Military leaders cited enemy body counts as indicators of success. Officials reassured the public that escalation was calibrated and strategic. They maintained that the war was difficult but manageable. Even after the Tet Offensive in 1968 exposed vulnerabilities and intensified public doubt, the official narrative adapted rather than collapsed. The Johnson administration acknowledged challenges but maintained that withdrawal without stability would invite greater chaos. When Richard Nixon assumed office in 1969, the framing shifted slightly. He introduced the concept of Vietnamization, emphasizing the transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while gradually reducing American troop presence. The objective, according to official statements, was peace with honor rather than abrupt retreat. The continuity across administrations rested on several key themes: containment of communism, preservation of credibility, defense of allies, and strategic patience. Internally, as later revealed, debates and doubts existed. But publicly, the official explanation maintained coherence. Policy adjustments were presented as strategic recalibrations, not admissions of fundamental error. Then, in June 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from a classified Department of Defense study titled United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945 to 1967. The documents had been leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, a former Marine officer and defense analyst who had worked on the study while affiliated with the Rand Corporation. Ellsberg had initially supported U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but became increasingly disillusioned after witnessing the war firsthand and reviewing classified materials. He secretly photocopied thousands of pages and eventually provided them to the press. The first article appeared on June 13, 1971. It detailed previously undisclosed information about the origins and expansion of U.S. involvement. It reported that internal government analyses had long questioned the feasibility of achieving stated objectives. It revealed covert actions in Laos and Cambodia that had not been publicly acknowledged at the time they occurred. The Nixon administration responded quickly. Although the Pentagon study covered events largely predating Nixon's presidency, the administration argued that publication posed a grave threat to national security. The Department of Justice sought a court injunction to prevent further publication, asserting that the disclosure of classified information could compromise diplomatic negotiations and endanger American lives. The legal argument centered on prior restraint. The government contended that preventing publication was necessary to protect national security interests. The press countered that such restraint violated the First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press. The case moved rapidly through the courts. In New York Times Company versus United States, 1971, the Supreme Court considered whether the federal government could block newspapers from publishing classified material of significant public interest. The court's decision, issued on June 30, 1971, was narrow but decisive. In a per curiam opinion, the justices ruled 6-3 that the government had not met the heavy burden required to justify prior restraint. The injunctions were lifted. The ruling did not declare that all classified information could be published without consequence. It addressed specifically the attempt to prevent publication before it occurred. Several concurring opinions emphasized the essential role of a free press in checking executive power. Justice Hugo Black wrote that only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. The official narrative following the ruling remained measured but firm. The Nixon administration maintained that the leak was illegal and irresponsible. It pursued criminal charges against Daniel Ellsberg under the Espionage Act of 1917. Officials argued that regardless of the public interest in the material, unauthorized disclosure of classified information undermined national security. Ellsberg's trial began in 1973, but ultimately collapsed due to government misconduct unrelated directly to the content of the papers. Revelations that members of the Nixon administration had authorized a break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, among other actions, led the judge to dismiss the charges. Separate from the legal battle over publication, the content of the Pentagon Papers prompted broader institutional responses. The Department of Defense acknowledged that the study accurately represented internal deliberations from prior administrations. However, officials emphasized that the documents were historical in nature. They argued that the study did not reflect current operational plans or ongoing negotiations. From the administration's perspective, the primary concern was not embarrassment, but precedent. If classified studies could be leaked and published without restraint, it would become more difficult to conduct candid internal analyses in the future. The official explanation framed secrecy as a necessary component of governance in matters of war and diplomacy. Leaders contended that candid policy discussions required confidentiality. Disclosure, they argued, could deter honest internal debate and compromise strategic flexibility. It is important to note that the Pentagon Papers did not reveal a single coordinated strategy to deceive the public across all administrations. Instead, they documented a series of decisions shaped by evolving circumstances, internal disagreements, and geopolitical pressures. The papers showed that multiple presidents had expanded involvement incrementally. They documented doubts about South Vietnam's stability. They recorded internal recognition that public messaging sometimes diverged from private assessments. The official position did not deny these discrepancies. Rather, it contextualized them. Administrations argued that public optimism served strategic purposes. Expressing doubt publicly could embolden adversaries and weaken alliances. In wartime, leaders maintained, confidence was not merely rhetorical, but operational. Historians aligned with the mainstream interpretation have often emphasized bureaucratic momentum rather than coordinated deception. Once significant military commitments were made, withdrawal carried its own risks. The fear of appearing weak in the context of the Cold War shaped policy decisions. From this perspective, the Pentagon Papers revealed flawed judgment and overconfidence, but not necessarily a unified conspiracy. At the same time, the documents undeniably demonstrated that the scope of U.S. involvement had expanded beyond what many citizens understood. They showed that certain actions, including secret bombing campaigns in neighboring countries, had not been transparently disclosed. In public statements following the Supreme Court ruling, Nixon administration officials reiterated that their concern lay with the process of leaking, not with suppressing historical debate. They distinguished between policy disagreements and the protection of classified information. The institutional response thus had two tracks: legal defense of executive authority and acknowledgement of past strategic miscalculations. The broader system adapted. Congress began reconsidering its oversight role. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, enacted over President Nixon's veto, sought to limit the executive branch's ability to commit U.S. forces without congressional approval. The resolution required notification to Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops and restricted deployment to 60 days without explicit authorization. The Pentagon Papers were not the sole cause of this legislation, but they contributed to a climate of scrutiny. Within the intelligence community, classification procedures were reviewed. Discussions emerged about balancing secrecy with accountability. The mainstream narrative that solidified in subsequent decades framed the Pentagon Papers as a pivotal moment for press freedom and democratic transparency. It acknowledged that the documents exposed discrepancies between public statements and internal assessments. It also maintained that governance during the Cold War involved complex trade-offs. Under this interpretation, the leak strengthened democratic institutions by clarifying the boundaries of executive power and press authority. It did not dismantle the national security apparatus, but it introduced new skepticism into public discourse. The official narrative, therefore, rests on several core assertions. First, that the Vietnam War policy evolved under immense geopolitical pressure. Second, that internal doubts did not equate to deliberate public deception, but reflected uncertainty inherent in complex conflicts. Third, that secrecy, while controversial, was considered essential for diplomatic and military strategy. Fourth, that the legal confrontation affirmed constitutional protections without nullifying the government's authority to classify sensitive information. The Pentagon Papers entered public consciousness as both a historical archive and a constitutional test. From the government's standpoint, the episode underscored the tension between transparency and security. The documents did not immediately end the war. U.S. involvement continued until the fall of Saigon in 1975. But the public's relationship to official statements had shifted. Even within official accounts, acknowledgement of that shift became part of the narrative. The leak demonstrated that internal assessments could diverge sharply from public messaging. It reinforced the press's watchdog role. it prompted legislative recalibration. Yet the institutions themselves remained intact. The Department of Defense continued operations. The intelligence community expanded in new directions. Executive authority in matters of national security persisted, albeit with increased scrutiny. In the years that followed, the Pentagon Papers became a reference point in debates about whistleblowing, press freedom, and the boundaries of secrecy. Within the official framing, the episode is remembered as a constitutional confrontation resolved within legal parameters. It is characterized as evidence that democratic systems can self-correct through institutional checks and balances. But that framing did not prevent alternative interpretations from emerging. Because for some observers, the existence of documented internal doubt, while public optimism continued, was not merely a bureaucratic artifact. It was evidence of something deeper. Those interpretations would grow in the years ahead. And they began almost immediately after the ink dried on the Supreme Court's decision. The first wave of conspiracy theories. When the Pentagon Papers were published in the summer of 1971, the official story was still being defended in courtrooms and press conferences. But outside those institutions, another interpretation was already forming. For many Americans, the documents did not simply reveal misjudgment or strategic confusion. They appeared to confirm something more deliberate. A belief that the government had knowingly misled the public about the nature and trajectory of the Vietnam War. This was not yet the language of deep state or algorithm-driven amplification. It was the language of protest signs, campus teach-ins, veterans' testimonies, and underground newspapers. The first wave of conspiracy thinking surrounding the Pentagon Papers emerged not from obscure corners, but from an already fractured political climate. By 1971, public trust had already eroded significantly. The Tet Offensive in 1968 had shaken confidence in official progress reports. Graphic television footage had narrowed the emotional distance between the battlefield and American households. The draft had pulled young men into a conflict many increasingly questioned. Civil rights protests, urban unrest, and generational tension were reshaping the national mood. The Pentagon Papers did not create that distrust. They appeared to validate it. The earliest alternative interpretations centered on a simple but powerful idea that the war had been prolonged, despite internal recognition that victory was unlikely. The documents showed that doubts about South Vietnam's political stability existed years before large-scale troop deployments. They recorded internal assessments, acknowledging limited probability of long-term success. They revealed that certain escalations were undertaken with awareness of significant risk and uncertainty. For critics of the war, these disclosures felt less like bureaucratic hindsight and more like confirmation of intentional deception. Early allegations coalesced around several themes. First, that successive administrations had knowingly misrepresented the scope and feasibility of the war. The argument was not merely that leaders were overly optimistic, but that they consciously chose public messaging that contradicted private analysis. Second, that casualty levels were politically tolerated. Some critics argued that troop escalations were timed around electoral cycles, suggesting that domestic political considerations influenced military decisions. Although the documents did not explicitly outline such calculations in those terms, skeptics pointed to patterns in troop surges and de-escalations that aligned with campaign seasons. Third, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident had been used as a pretext. Questions about the accuracy of reported attacks, particularly the second alleged attack, fueled speculation that the resolution granting broad war powers had been based on incomplete or misleading information. These ideas circulated through anti-war organizations, veterans groups, and student movements. College campuses became focal points of discussion. Teach-ins dissected excerpts from the papers. Underground publications reprinted portions with commentary, suggesting that the war represented not just strategic error, but systemic manipulation. The cultural environment amplified these interpretations. The Pentagon Papers were released during the same era that would soon expose the Watergate scandal. The early 1970s saw revelations of FBI surveillance programs targeting activists and civil rights leaders. The Church Committee investigations in 1975 would uncover previously undisclosed intelligence operations conducted domestically and abroad. In that broader context, the idea that the Vietnam War had been shaped by concealed motives did not feel implausible to many observers. Early conspiracy thinking did not yet frame the issue as a unified, shadowy apparatus controlling all branches of government. Instead, it focused on executive power and national security institutions. Some activists argued that the war had become self-perpetuating, sustained not by clear strategic objectives, but by institutional momentum. They suggested that defense contractors, military leadership, and political officials had become entangled in a system that incentivized continuation over resolution. The concept of the military-industrial complex, introduced publicly by President Dwight Eisenhower in his 1961 farewell address, resurfaced in conversations. Critics connected Eisenhower's warning about defense industry influence to the prolonged conflict in Vietnam. Although the Pentagon Papers themselves did not document profit motives driving policy, they reinforced the perception that public narratives were managed. Journalists and scholars began to examine the relationship between government briefings and media reporting. Some suggested that press reliance on official sources had contributed to the gap between internal assessments and public understanding. The early 1970s underground press adopted sharper language. Headlines spoke of hidden wars, secret bombings, and manufactured consent. The phrase manufactured consent, though later popularized in academic contexts, captured a growing suspicion that public support for the war had been shaped through selective disclosure. One of the central claims of this first wave was not that a single secret committee orchestrated events across decades, but that the architecture of secrecy itself enabled distortion. If classified intelligence could contradict public statements without immediate consequence, critics asked, how could citizens evaluate policy decisions effectively? Veterans returning from Vietnam added another dimension. Organizations such as Vietnam Veterans Against the War held public hearings where former soldiers testified about experiences that differed from official descriptions. Their accounts reinforced the perception that the war's realities were being filtered before reaching the public. Meanwhile, Daniel Ellsberg himself became a symbolic figure. Supporters framed him as a whistleblower exposing institutional dishonesty. Opponents viewed him as reckless and disloyal. The polarization surrounding his actions intensified debate about the legitimacy of leaking classified material. The conspiracy narratives of this early period often centered on intent. Were leaders trapped by Cold War logic, making incremental decisions that collectively deepened involvement? Or did they knowingly continue a conflict they believed unwinnable to avoid political fallout? The Pentagon Papers provided documentation of doubt. They did not explicitly record a coordinated agreement to deceive the public. But for many readers, the contrast between internal pessimism and public optimism felt too stark to dismiss as simple miscalculation. Cultural and political forces amplified these interpretations. The youth counterculture, already skeptical of traditional authority structures, embraced the papers as proof that institutional narratives required scrutiny. Folk musicians, political cartoonists, and filmmakers incorporated themes of secrecy and betrayal into their work. At the same time, conservative commentators expressed a different kind of concern. Some argued that the leak itself represented a threat to national stability. They warned that internal deliberations, when exposed publicly, could undermine trust not only in specific policies, but in governance itself. Thus, early conspiracy discourse formed along multiple axes. On one side were those who believed the papers demonstrated calculated deception. On another were those who believed the real danger lay in eroding institutional cohesion. Importantly, the first wave of theories did not yet incorporate later developments such as digital surveillance, online echo chambers, or globalized misinformation. Their arguments were rooted in tangible documents and recent lived experience. The papers appeared to confirm that internal government history differed from public presentation. For some observers, that difference was evidence of necessary strategic framing during wartime. For others, it was proof that democratic consent had been compromised. The intensity of the reaction cannot be separated from the emotional weight of the conflict itself. By 1971, tens of thousands of American soldiers had died. Vietnamese casualties were exponentially higher. Families had endured years of uncertainty. In that context, discovering that leaders privately questioned the war's prospects felt personal. The first wave of conspiracy thinking around the Pentagon Papers was therefore less about abstract ideology and more about accountability. It asked whether officials had crossed the line from cautious messaging into deliberate misrepresentation. It questioned whether information control during wartime had shielded citizens from realities they had a right to confront. It scrutinized whether the architecture of secrecy allowed policy to drift beyond democratic oversight. These early interpretations did not yet form a unified doctrine. They were fragmented, debated, and contested. But they introduced a new lens through which future conflicts would be viewed. If one war's internal history revealed divergence from public messaging, observers began to ask whether similar patterns might exist elsewhere. The Pentagon Papers became not just a historical archive, but a reference point. They suggested that official narratives could be incomplete. They demonstrated that classified assessments might tell a more complicated story. And in doing so, they planted a durable question in public consciousness. If leaders manage information during wartime, where does strategic necessity end and controlled truth begin? The decades that followed would see that question resurface repeatedly, but its modern echoes trace back to that first wave, when newly revealed documents collided with an already divided nation, and suspicion shifted from rumor to record. Evidence and patterns cited by supporters. If the first wave of conspiracy thinking emerged from shock and interpretation, the next phase centered on documentation. The Pentagon Papers were not rumors whispered in private. They were 7,000 pages of internal memoranda, intelligence estimates, diplomatic cables, and policy analyses compiled by the Department of Defense itself. Supporters of alternative interpretations returned repeatedly to the same question. What specifically did the documents show? And more importantly, what patterns could be traced across administrations? One of the most frequently cited elements was the record of internal doubt. Within the papers were memoranda expressing skepticism about the viability of South Vietnam's government. Analysts questioned whether U.S. support could compensate for political instability and lack of popular legitimacy in Saigon. Some assessments warned that even significant troop increases might not produce decisive victory. These internal evaluations stood in contrast to public messaging that emphasized measurable progress. In 1965 and 1966, press briefings often highlighted enemy casualties as evidence that U.S. forces were weakening the opposition. The papers, however, documented private recognition that body count metrics did not necessarily translate into strategic advantage. Supporters of the controlled truth interpretation argue that this divergence was not incidental. They point to specific entries where officials acknowledged that the war's prospects were uncertain, even bleak, while continuing to frame public communication around optimism. It is important to distinguish categories here. Verified fact. The Pentagon Papers contain documented instances of internal skepticism about achieving long-term success in Vietnam. Verified fact. Public statements during the same period frequently expressed confidence in progress. Disputed claim. That these contradictions constituted a coordinated effort to deceive the public, rather than an attempt to maintain morale and strategic posture. Speculative extension. That deception was knowingly prolonged for political or institutional preservation. Another frequently cited issue is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The papers revealed that uncertainties existed regarding the second reported attack on U.S. naval vessels in August 1964. Internal communications suggested ambiguity in radar and sonar readings. While the first encounter was widely accepted as an engagement, the second event appeared less clear even at the time. Publicly, however, the Johnson administration presented the attacks as unambiguous acts of aggression, prompting swift congressional authorization for expanded military action. Supporters of alternative interpretations argue that the urgency and clarity conveyed publicly did not reflect the uncertainty documented privately. Verified fact. Internal communications acknowledged confusion about aspects of the second incident. Verified fact. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution granted broad authority based on the reported attacks. Disputed claim that the ambiguity was intentionally concealed to manufacture justification for escalation. Speculation that the incident served as a pretext rather than a reaction. The papers also documented covert operations beyond Vietnam's borders. Secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos were conducted without broad public disclosure. Internal memoranda detailed these operations, while official statements often minimized or omitted their scope. Supporters argue that the existence of such covert actions illustrates a structural gap between operational reality and public understanding. Verified fact. Bombing operations in neighboring countries were conducted covertly. Verified fact. Public acknowledgement of these operations was limited at the time they occurred. Disputed claim. That concealment reflected an overarching strategy of systematic manipulation rather than wartime secrecy. Speculative interpretation. That undisclosed operations demonstrate a broader culture of narrative control. Timelines are another focal point. When analysts trace escalation patterns, they note that troop deployments increased even after internal assessments questioned the likelihood of decisive victory. For example, internal memoranda from 1965 indicated concern that bombing campaigns might not force North Vietnam to negotiate, yet troop commitments continued to expand. Supporters of the theory argue that this pattern suggests continuation despite awareness of diminishing returns. Skeptics counter that policymakers often pursue strategies incrementally, hoping to alter variables before conceding failure. Verified fact. Internal doubts coexisted with continued escalation. Disputed claim. That escalation in the face of doubt proves intentional disregard for public consent. Speculative extension. That policy inertia was less influential than political self-preservation. Redactions and classification battles further fuel suspicion. Although the bulk of the Pentagon Papers became public, some sections were initially withheld or heavily redacted. Supporters argue that the existence of redacted passages implies that even the released material may not represent the full picture. Freedom of Information Act requests in subsequent decades sought related documents, sometimes encountering resistance or delay. Verified fact. Portions of related files remained classified for years. Disputed claim. That continued classification indicates hidden evidence of more extensive wrongdoing. Speculative interpretation. That missing records conceal deeper strategic motives. Media omission is another area frequently cited. Critics argue that mainstream outlets were initially hesitant to pursue investigative angles that contradicted official briefings. They suggest that reliance on government sources limited early reporting. It was not until the leak forced publication that broader scrutiny intensified. Verified fact. Journalistic norms of the 1950s and early 1960s often involved close relationships with government officials. Verified fact. Investigative reporting expanded significantly after the Pentagon Papers and Watergate. Disputed claim. That media institutions knowingly suppressed contradictory evidence prior to the leak. Speculative interpretation. That press dependency functioned as an informal extension of narrative control. Supporters also point to language patterns within internal documents. Repeated references to credibility, appearance, and public perception appear in memoranda discussing policy options. Critics argue that these terms reveal concern not only with strategic outcomes, but with maintaining political standing. Verified fact. Internal discussions included consideration of U.S. credibility abroad. Disputed claim. That credibility concerns equate to deliberate public manipulation. Speculation. That preserving image outweighed transparency in policy decisions. Another pattern frequently emphasized is cross-administration continuity. The papers documented involvement spanning 4 presidential administrations: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. Each incrementally expanded commitment. Supporters argue that this continuity suggests structural momentum rather than isolated miscalculation. If multiple administrations independently deepened involvement while acknowledging internal risk, critics ask whether institutional logic superseded democratic deliberation. Skeptics respond that geopolitical consensus during the Cold War explains policy alignment more convincingly than coordinated concealment. One of the more symbolic interpretations centers on the study's very existence. Why commission a secret internal history unless leaders recognized a discrepancy between internal knowledge and public narrative? Supporters argue that the act of compiling a classified historical record indicates awareness of accumulated contradiction. Verified fact. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered the study in 1967. Verified fact. The study was intended for internal use only. Disputed claim. That commissioning the study implies admission of deception rather than desire for policy evaluation. Speculative interpretation. That internal documentation served as a safeguard against external accountability. The psychological dimension also plays a role in sustaining belief. When citizens learn that official messaging diverged from internal assessment, the revelation often carries emotional weight. The perceived breach of trust can magnify interpretation of subsequent events. For supporters of the theory, the Pentagon Papers represent proof that governments are capable of shaping public perception strategically. They argue that once such shaping is confirmed in one context, skepticism toward later conflicts becomes rational rather than conspiratorial. This line of reasoning extends beyond Vietnam. Comparisons are frequently drawn to later controversies, such as intelligence assessments preceding the Iraq War. While those events fall outside the scope of the papers themselves, supporters see historical precedent in documented internal public divergence. It is important to maintain distinction. Verified, the Pentagon Papers documented internal skepticism and undisclosed operations. Disputed, that these elements constitute a single orchestrated program of long-term deception. Speculative, that the Vietnam case reveals an enduring model of narrative control. The persistence of belief in controlled truth rests not on a single document, but on cumulative patterns. Internal doubt paired with public optimism. Covert operations paired with limited disclosure. Strategic language emphasizing credibility and perception. Legal efforts to prevent publication. For supporters, these patterns form a coherent narrative. That information during wartime is filtered deliberately to maintain policy momentum. For critics, the same patterns reflect the complexity and opacity inherent in large-scale governance under geopolitical pressure. The distinction between necessary secrecy and manipulative concealment remains contested. The Pentagon Papers did not provide direct evidence of a unified conspiracy across administrations. They did not record explicit discussions of intentionally misleading the public for purely political survival, but they did expose internal contradictions. And for many observers, once contradictions are documented, the burden of explanation shifts. Was the divergence an inevitable feature of wartime governance? Or evidence that democratic transparency can be subordinated to strategic messaging? The documents themselves remain fixed in archival record. What varies is interpretation. And as those interpretations evolved, the conversation moved beyond printed pages into a rapidly changing media landscape, where amplification, reinterpretation, and skepticism would take on new forms. That evolution is where the story turns next. Evolution, amplification, and counter-analysis. When the Pentagon Papers were first published, the debate unfolded in courtrooms, newspapers, and university auditoriums. But over the decades that followed, the documents took on a life beyond their immediate historical context. They stopped being only about Vietnam. They became a reference point, a precedent, a warning, a symbol. And as the media landscape evolved, so did the narratives surrounding them. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the Vietnam War began transitioning from lived experience into historical memory. Academic scholarship expanded. Memoirs from policymakers, journalists, and military officers offered retrospective analysis. Films and literature reinterpreted the war through cultural storytelling. Within this environment, the Pentagon Papers were increasingly cited as evidence of institutional opacity. Scholars debated whether the documents revealed deliberate deception or systemic misjudgment. Some historians argued that the papers demonstrated bureaucratic momentum, a slow accumulation of incremental decisions driven by Cold War logic rather than centralized manipulation. Others suggested that the internal acknowledgement of low success probabilities pointed to a more troubling dynamic, that political leaders feared appearing weak more than they feared prolonging conflict. The language shifted from protest to structural critique. Terms like credibility gap entered academic discourse. The gap described the widening distance between official statements and observable reality. The Pentagon Papers were positioned as documentary proof that such a gap had existed at the highest levels of government. At the same time, broader revelations reinforced skepticism. The Watergate scandal exposed presidential misconduct unrelated to Vietnam, but deeply consequential for public trust. The Church Committee investigations revealed covert CIA and FBI activities, including surveillance of domestic groups. These disclosures did not emerge directly from the Pentagon Papers, but they unfolded in the same historical window. For some observers, the cumulative effect was powerful. The Pentagon Papers became part of a larger pattern, evidence that institutions could operate in secrecy while presenting a curated narrative publicly. By the 1990s, digital archiving began expanding access to historical documents. Portions of the papers were searchable online. Academic institutions integrated them into curricula. The documents became less rare and more widely accessible. Then the internet transformed amplification entirely. In the early 2000s, new geopolitical conflicts reshaped public debate about government transparency. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified in part by intelligence assessments regarding weapons of mass destruction, triggered renewed scrutiny of executive claims. When those weapons were not found, comparisons to Vietnam resurfaced. Commentators referenced the Pentagon Papers as precedent, suggesting that internal intelligence assessments might once again diverge from public justification. This comparison marked a turning point. The papers were no longer discussed solely in historical analysis. They became part of contemporary argument. Online forums dissected parallels. Blog posts framed Vietnam and Iraq as examples of recurring narrative management. Independent documentary filmmakers revisited the papers through modern lenses. Social media platforms accelerated these conversations. Unlike the 1970s, where distribution depended on physical newspapers or broadcast networks, digital platforms allowed reinterpretation without institutional gatekeeping. Clips, excerpts, and quotations circulated rapidly. The phrase "controlled truth" emerged more frequently in online discourse, not as a term used in the original documents, but as a conceptual summary offered by critics. In these spaces, the Pentagon Papers were sometimes framed not as a singular episode, but as the origin point of a broader distrust toward federal institutions. The narrative expanded. Some commentators argued that the papers revealed a template. Internal intelligence filtered through political calculation before reaching the public. Others linked Vietnam to later whistleblower cases, including those involving classified surveillance programs and diplomatic cables. The name Daniel Ellsberg became associated not only with Vietnam, but with the archetype of the whistleblower. When Edward Snowden disclosed classified National Security Agency documents in 2013, many journalists drew parallels. Both cases involved classified material revealing internal operations. Both sparked debate about secrecy versus transparency. Both divided public opinion. This amplification did not unfold in a vacuum. Public trust surveys show that confidence in federal institutions declined significantly from the late 1960s onward. While multiple factors contributed to this decline, the Pentagon Papers were frequently cited as a symbolic rupture. They demonstrated that internal assessments could contradict public messaging. That knowledge, once internalized, changed how subsequent claims were received. However, as narratives expanded, so did counter-analysis. Historians and policy experts caution against oversimplification. One of the central counter-arguments is fragmentation. The Pentagon Papers documented disagreements among policymakers. They revealed internal debates, conflicting analyses, and uncertainty. Far from showing a unified secret strategy, some scholars argue that the papers expose institutional disarray. From this perspective, the divergence between internal and public messaging reflects political caution rather than orchestrated deception. Leaders may have feared that publicly expressing doubt would weaken negotiations or embolden adversaries. The Cold War context amplified these concerns. Critics of conspiracy framing also point to hindsight bias. Knowing the eventual outcome of the war, it is tempting to interpret internal skepticism as confirmation that leaders knew defeat was inevitable. But at the time, decision-makers operated within uncertainty. Intelligence assessments are probabilistic, not deterministic. Another counterpoint addresses scale. The Pentagon Papers covered policy through 1967. They did not include Nixon's secret negotiations or later strategy adjustments. The documents provide a historical snapshot rather than a comprehensive account of all wartime decisions. Legal scholars also emphasize that the Supreme Court ruling did not dismantle classification authority. The decision addressed prior restraint, not the broader legitimacy of secrecy in national defense. Thus, while the papers affirmed press freedom, they did not render the executive branch powerless in protecting classified information. Yet belief in systemic narrative control persists. Why? Part of the answer lies in pattern recognition. When citizens observe that internal doubts existed during Vietnam and later observe disputed intelligence in other conflicts, they may interpret these as connected episodes rather than isolated cases. The psychological phenomenon of pattern seeking can reinforce this connection. Humans are predisposed to link events into coherent narratives. Once a precedent is established, that public messaging can diverge from internal assessment. Future discrepancies are more readily interpreted through that lens. Another factor is institutional complexity. Large bureaucracies generate vast amounts of classified information. The public rarely sees the full archive. This opacity can foster suspicion, even in the absence of direct evidence. The Pentagon Papers provide tangible proof that hidden documentation can alter historical understanding. That proof alone reshapes expectations. Digital media also alters perception. Algorithms prioritize emotionally resonant content. Historical documents framed as evidence of deception generate engagement. As excerpts circulate without full context, narratives can simplify. Where the original papers were dense and technical, modern reinterpretations often condense them into symbolic shorthand. Proof that governments lie. This condensation intensifies polarization. Some viewers interpret the papers as evidence that democratic institutions corrected themselves through legal processes and press freedom. Others interpret them as evidence that only whistleblowing disrupts entrenched secrecy. The same historical event sustains opposing conclusions. Counter-analysis does not deny that the papers exposed contradictions. Rather, it questions the leap from contradiction to conspiracy. Bureaucratic systems are not monolithic. Policy decisions emerge from competing interests, incomplete intelligence, and geopolitical pressure. The continuation of the war, despite internal skepticism, may reflect risk aversion, fear that withdrawal would signal weakness globally. It may reflect optimism bias, belief that conditions could shift. It may reflect incremental commitment, the difficulty of reversing course once substantial resources are invested. Critics argue that these explanations, while imperfect, are more consistent with documented decision-making processes than the notion of a unified long-term deception campaign. Yet even among skeptics, few dispute that the papers altered the relationship between citizens and official narratives. They introduced a lasting question. When leaders communicate certainty publicly, how much internal doubt remains unseen? That question lingers across administrations. In contemporary discourse, the Pentagon Papers occupy a dual role. They are celebrated as a triumph of investigative journalism and constitutional balance. They are also invoked as cautionary evidence that governments may manage information strategically. The tension between those interpretations fuels ongoing debate. And despite extensive historical analysis, the central issue remains unsettled for many observers. Was the Vietnam War prolonged primarily due to strategic miscalculation under Cold War pressure? Or did leaders consciously prioritize political credibility over transparent communication? The papers provide documentation, but not final interpretation. As narratives continue to evolve, the event's significance expands beyond its original context. The leak did not dismantle institutions, but it permanently complicated the assumption that official narratives represent the full internal picture. And in a world where information now moves instantly, that complication echoes louder than ever. The next question is not what the papers revealed. It is what they changed. Because once trust fractures, even partially, it rarely returns to its original form. And that shift, psychological, cultural, structural, carries consequences far beyond a single war. Impact and uncertainty. When the Pentagon Papers entered public view, they did more than challenge a war. They altered the psychological contract between citizens and the institutions that govern them. Until that moment, many Americans assumed that while governments might withhold operational details, the broad narrative offered to the public reflected genuine strategic belief. The papers complicated that assumption. They showed that internal assessments could diverge sharply from external messaging, not necessarily in dramatic speeches, but in tone, confidence, and expectation. That divergence became the lasting impact. In the years following the leak, journalism changed. Newsrooms grew more assertive. Investigative reporting expanded. Editors increasingly questioned official briefings rather than accepting them at face value. The Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal together marked a transition into what some scholars describe as the adversarial press era. The Supreme Court's ruling in New York Times Company versus United States reinforced the constitutional protection of publication in the face of executive pressure. The decision did not eliminate secrecy, but it established that the burden to justify suppressing publication was extraordinarily high. That legal affirmation strengthened the press institutionally. Culturally, however, the effect was more complicated. For many citizens, the papers became shorthand for a broader lesson: that governments are capable of shaping narratives strategically during wartime. Trust surveys conducted over subsequent decades show a noticeable decline in public confidence in federal institutions, beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s. While multiple factors contributed to this trend, the Vietnam era, and the revelations surrounding it, remain central in historical analysis. The impact extended beyond journalism. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, seeking to reassert legislative oversight over military deployment. Intelligence oversight mechanisms were expanded after subsequent investigations revealed covert operations. Classification procedures were scrutinized, though not dismantled. Institutional checks were strengthened. Yet mistrust did not disappear. Instead, it evolved. Psychologically, the Pentagon Papers introduced what some analysts describe as the betrayal effect. When citizens perceive that leaders communicated with confidence while privately harboring doubt, the emotional reaction can exceed that produced by policy failure alone. Failure can be forgiven. Perceived concealment is harder to reconcile. The distinction between strategic messaging and deliberate deception is often subtle. In wartime, leaders argue that projecting confidence can stabilize alliances and deter adversaries. Critics argue that projecting confidence despite private skepticism compromises informed consent. The papers sit at that intersection. They did not provide a definitive answer about intent. They documented internal uncertainty and public reassurance. Interpretation filled the gap. Media framing in the modern era has further complicated that interpretation. Digital platforms reward emotionally resonant content. Historical documents are often distilled into symbolic statements, proof of lies, evidence of manipulation, government exposed. Nuance can fade when compressed into viral clips. At the same time, the availability of primary documents allows independent analysis. Citizens can read excerpts directly, rather than relying solely on institutional summaries. This dual effect, amplification and access, sustains debate. Algorithms prioritize engagement. Engagement often favors controversy. As discussions about Vietnam resurface in contemporary geopolitical debates, the Pentagon Papers are invoked repeatedly. They have become part of the architecture of skepticism. Human pattern-seeking behavior also plays a role. Once a historical example demonstrates divergence between public and internal narratives, individuals may look for similar divergences elsewhere. The existence of one confirmed contradiction increases sensitivity to others. This does not necessarily mean that all future claims of deception are accurate. It means that the threshold of automatic trust shifts. The Pentagon Papers therefore operate less as an isolated event and more as a cognitive precedent. They demonstrated that hidden documentation can alter public understanding decades later. That awareness changes how citizens evaluate current information. Despite the thousands of pages released, questions remain. Not all related documents were immediately declassified. Some materials connected to Vietnam policy were released gradually over decades. Redactions persisted in certain records. Memoirs from policymakers occasionally contradict one another. Intelligence assessments often rely on incomplete data. Decision-making under geopolitical pressure rarely yields clear moral lines. These ambiguities sustain uncertainty. Were leaders trapped in a web of Cold War containment logic that limited their perceived options? Did incremental commitment create a path dependency that made withdrawal politically and strategically risky? Or did concerns about domestic political standing weigh more heavily than public transparency? The papers document deliberation. They do not fully illuminate motivation. Unanswered questions linger beyond Vietnam itself. How should democratic societies balance secrecy with accountability? What degree of internal doubt must be disclosed for consent to remain meaningful? Can strategic messaging coexist with transparent governance? These questions have resurfaced in later conflicts and intelligence controversies. Each generation revisits them with new context. The Pentagon Papers serve as a reminder that institutional narratives are constructed within constraints: political, diplomatic, military. They also remind us that those constraints are subject to scrutiny. Reflecting on the episode decades later, historians often describe it as a moment when institutional power encountered constitutional limits and public skepticism simultaneously. The executive branch asserted national security. The press asserted constitutional protection. The courts weighed competing principles. The public interpreted the outcome. In that sense, the system functioned. The injunction was denied. Publication continued. The whistleblower faced trial, and the charges were dismissed due to prosecutorial misconduct. Legislative oversight expanded. Yet even as institutions adapted, perception shifted. Trust, once fractured, recalibrates slowly. The Pentagon Papers did not dismantle American governance. They did not end the Cold War. They did not resolve the Vietnam conflict immediately, but they introduced enduring complexity into the relationship between information and authority. They demonstrated that historical record and public narrative can diverge, sometimes significantly, and they forced a confrontation with the question of who controls that divergence. As we reach the end of this examination, the story resists tidy resolution. The Pentagon Papers confirmed that internal skepticism existed alongside public reassurance. They confirmed that certain operations were conducted covertly. They confirmed that executive power can attempt to restrain publication. They did not conclusively prove unified, long-term orchestration of deception across administrations. They did not provide explicit evidence that political preservation superseded all strategic reasoning. They exist in the space between confirmation and interpretation. In that space, belief and skepticism coexist. Democratic societies rely on informed consent. Informed consent depends on access to information. Yet, national security frameworks rely on confidentiality. The tension between those principles remains unresolved. Perhaps that tension is not an anomaly, but a structural feature of governance in a globalized, competitive world. Perhaps transparency and secrecy will always exist in uneasy balance. The Pentagon Papers remind us that when hidden documentation surfaces, it can reshape historical understanding, not because it invents new events, but because it reframes what was known, when it was known, and by whom. They leave us with a question that extends beyond Vietnam. When leaders speak with certainty, what internal uncertainties remain unseen? And how much uncertainty can a democracy tolerate before trust erodes? The answers are not fixed. They evolve with each generation, each conflict, each disclosure. The theories and interpretations discussed in this documentary reflect documented historical records and public debate. Allegations of deception or narrative control represent interpretations advanced by various commentators and are not asserted here as established fact beyond what primary documents confirm. This content is presented for informational and discussion purposes only. No claim is made to defame or misrepresent any individual or institution. The historical events described are based on publicly available records and scholarly analysis. History is rarely simple. Documents reveal fragments. Interpretation connects them. Perspective shapes meaning. Thank you for watching Whims and Whispers. If you found this examination thoughtful, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations where history, power, and uncertainty intersect. And let us know in the comments. Which historical document leak or political controversy should we explore next? Until next time, stay curious and keep listening for the whispers behind the headlines.